Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who are joining us today for this interesting and I'm hoping also very informative event. We want to welcome the expert panel who is going to talk to us about the compound risks, early warning systems, and in the context of a fragility and conflict, which is in itself quite a challenge and a topic which is occupying the attention of many across the globe. My name is Indira Konjhodzic. I'm the lead operation officer in the World Bank Group. I'm leading the team working on the Global Crisis Risk Platform. We focus on the interaction of different risk dimensions, including the macro-financial, food crisis, health outbreaks, natural disasters, and conflict. It's my pleasure today to welcome a distinguished group of speakers, starting with the Dirk-Jan Konjhodzic. He's a chief economist and head of Humanitarian Financing Strategy and Analysis Unit at the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. He's joined by Henk-Jan, the chief of Peacebuilding Strategy and Partnerships at United Nations Peacebuilding Support Office. We also welcome Catalina, Jaime, Climate and Conflict Manager at the Red Crescent Climate Center. I also wish to welcome two colleagues of mine, which is Lindsay Jones. He's an expert on the compound risks and also on the climate change and the resilience, amongst other things. And Demetriou. He's working on the conflict monitoring. He's the senior operation officer at the World Bank Group. So we have really a good group of people with expertise, and we wish to turn to them to invite their thoughts and reflections on how early warning systems can factor in issues on the compound risks within their design and implementation. It's not an easy exercise, as many of you may appreciate. And also, once we manage to do that, what does that mean for the supporting early action in conflict-affected areas? I should just briefly say what many of you are aware, which is that the COVID-19 is really almost like a wake-up call, that there is a need that we strengthen the attention to many of these risk management tools. Early warning systems in particular, they can be very helpful in signaling to the decision makers, to the actors, development actors, also humanitarian actors, that the things may be deteriorating, and in doing so, they provide an opportunity to connect it with the early action or anticipatory action. And by linking the two, that gives us an opportunity to help to save lives or to minimize the social, economic, and other costs that the societies or communities may be experiencing due to the multiple crises happening at the same time. And we know now, for instance, that the COVID-19 in many of these fragile and conflict-affected countries has exacerbated the existing fragilities and increased the social cost. But the health sector has impacted the employment. We have seen the reduction in remittances, and we also have seen the increase in the food insecurity. So the evidence is there telling all of us that there is a need to think of the crisis and risk through the compound lenses. Just briefly to mention to you what we are doing on the bank side, on the Global Crisis Risk Platform. We are developing a methodology how to monitor compound risks, so to help to better inform the decisions within the bank group. And the team is also working on the crisis. Within that, we are also developing methodology how to monitor conflict. So this also explains why we are one of the co-organizers of the session today, jointly with our partners, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, and the UN Peacebuilding Support Office, UNPBSO, together with our partners from the Red Crescent Climate Center. And I'm the one who has read a lot of their papers on the compound risk and benefited from the work of our partners. I always enjoy reading the cutting edge knowledge that they produce. So this is one of the series of events which is being organized by the World Bank and United Nations to better understand and monitor the overlap between the compound risks and also the early warning systems. So as we proceed, we plan to run this session as a fireside chat, which means there will be no PowerPoint presentations. We really want our panelists to feel relaxed and to share with us their thoughts and reflections on this very complex and demanding agenda. So when I say demanding, we also want to invite them to tell us what are the challenges that they're facing in designing such early warning systems or the monitoring tools and instruments, and how do they push this effort through their institution, how do they promote this effort in their institution, and what are maybe some of the lessons learned that they can share with us. I have a series of questions, and I will ask the panelists one by one. And I'm under strict guidance to monitor time. So I would ask the panelists to forgive me in advance if I cough after they speak for about 5 minutes. That's a signal that we need to wrap up and then to move to another one. So let me start. Maybe if I can turn to Dirk-Jan. So Dirk-Jan, you are leading the OCHA effort. You're particularly working on the anticipatory action framework, which guides investments in about $140 million of the United Nations Central Emergency Response Fund. Could you share with us some information about this work and what is needed in your experience in order to move the policymakers from the crisis response to anticipatory action? Over to you, Dirk-Jan.
Thank you, Indira, and what a delight and a pleasure to talk about how we are acting on risk and the work that we're doing with partners and the need to really work more on compound risk, the great work that we're doing together with the bank and PBSO and others. Let me just give a bit of an overview. So we've made an enormous amount of progress in terms of human development, but despite that progress, about 1 in 33 people still require humanitarian assistance. That's the highest we've ever seen it. And donors are increasingly generous, but needs are rising faster than their generosity. So we want more money to reach people in humanitarian need, but we simply don't have it. And so there's a real imperative to use the available funding as efficiently as possible. Now, normally what we do is be reactive. So as a crisis is taking place, a shock, a drought, a flood, and then we watch it unfold, we measure how many people are in need, we draw up a response plan, we fundraise, and we provide humanitarian assistance. And that will save a lot of lives. But we can do, of course, a lot better. And the Emergency Relief Coordinator set out a vision of what we can do to, instead of being a reactive actor, be an anticipatory actor, have an anticipatory approach to that. And we found out about half of the humanitarian needs are foreseeable and 20% is highly predictable. Yet only 1% of finance is pre-financed. So we believe that anticipatory action is cheaper, it's faster, more dignified, and it protects development gain. So if that's the case, why is that not the default approach to it? So first, I think there's a big conceptual misunderstanding of what anticipatory action is, and I believe that's inconsistent with humanitarian principles. But if you know a flood is coming, why do we wait to rescue people when they're on the roof and their house is submerged? And why don't we do something beforehand? If you know there's a drought, why do we wait for people to be starving and kids to end up in clinics to be fed? We can get ahead of that. We can give people cash to get out of harm's way, or can provide drought-tolerant seeds. And these 12 pilots you talked about, and we've set aside 140 million, are really designed to provide proof of concept, how it works, and it forces us to actually overcome conceptual, technical, and operational challenges. So we have selected 12 countries in different contexts and different geographies, different kind of complexities of humanitarian crises to showcase how this is being done. The second problem I think there is there is at least a perceived lack of evidence that it works. So we're working very closely together with the Center for Disaster Protection to really examine the process of putting together these frameworks, which consist of a pre-arranged action plan, pre-arranged finance, and a trigger mechanisms, and actually also have independent impact evaluation at the highest standards. And so we've done it now a couple of times, and actually we've learned, amongst other things, about 5 things. One, doing this is much faster. So the dispersal speed, for example, when we acted in Somalia ahead of a shock, was 3 times faster. In Bangladesh, we acted within 4 hours of a signal that there was going to be a flooding. So we measure water levels up in a river upstream, that will come down. When the water levels reach a particular threshold, within 4 hours, we managed to disperse finance to actually get to people in need. Second, actually, it is more efficient. In Bangladesh, for example, we reached more people at half the cost. And it is simply also cheaper. If you procure stuff ahead of a crisis, the price is simply cheaper, so lower. So FAO, UNFPA, all were able to generate significant cost savings as a result of moving earlier. It's also a lot more impactful, and here we are generating now some very interesting insights. So when we went to Somalia in June 2020, we had the compounding impact of COVID-19, floods, and desert locust. We set up a framework for drought. There was no drought, and this actually goes to a point that we're going to talk about later on. We didn't want to wait for reality to fit the model, right? So we activated the framework and released pre-arranged finance. So rapid rehabilitation of boreholes, cash transfers, preventive disease controls, all of that. And so, interestingly, WHO found that the outbreaks of key epidemiological diseases were like AWD, malaria, etc., were severely and significantly reduced compared to similar periods in previous time. Very interestingly, IOM, who led the rehabilitation of boreholes, like the anticipatory rehabilitation of boreholes, measured that household finances were better, people had better mental health, and interestingly, we had reduced migratory pressure and reduced conflict as a result. So they also had a peace building component, and I'm sure that Henk-Jan is very interested in that as well. Similarly, in Bangladesh, this is work done by colleagues at Oxford University. We gave a small cash transfer ahead of the peak flooding, and we measured 10 weeks after that what the impact was, and we saw that people who got the cash transfer were more likely to have been evacuated and they could evacuate their livestock, lower loss of assets, less likely to borrow. If they borrowed at a lower cost, better child and adult food consumption, and better life satisfaction, and they were more likely to recover quickly. So we found some really good evidence that is actually working, and so hopefully that evidence is now generating more donor interest and more willingness to move more financing on an ex-ante basis instead of continuing to be reactive.
Excellent, thanks so much, Dirk-Jan. So I heard from you really important points about the efficiency of acting early, because it allows us to be faster and to reach those in need faster. I heard about the cost saving, because you can procure the necessary stuff in order to respond. It allows you also better targeting and identifying those who will be most affected by it. So these are all extremely important points. This is all that could be gained through these early warning systems and linking them with the early action in terms of financing. Thanks very much for the excellent contribution. So let me turn now to Henk-Jan, somebody who has had extensive experience in promoting early warning, in promoting peace-building partnerships. So the question to you, Henk-Jan, is how the organizations like the World Bank and the United Nations can work together to promote operationalization of early warning systems in conflict and fragile settings. What is your experience and what would you like to share with us? Over to you, Henk-Jan. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much. Maybe first up front, we are really having a very good partnership with the bank on crisis settings. and really building on each other's comparative advantages. The bank having more money than the UN, having a lot of expertise. The UN having a bigger footprint, also covering areas such as humanitarian, human rights, where the bank does not have a mandate. And of course, we have our security operations and providing logistics support as well. Our overall arching framework is based on a joint policy document that we produced a few years ago called Pathways for Peace. And a couple of points from that report very clearly shows that we are living in a much more complex world with very many protracted and complex conflicts that are driven by multiple factors that are changing over time, are sometimes not clear. What is also very important that the number of actors are increasing so much. As during the Cold War, there were usually two set of actors, a government and an insurrection or a rebellion group, and it was relatively easy for the UN to put these two groups in a room and negotiate a peace agreement and put peacekeepers on the ground to implement that peace agreement. But we have now hundreds of non-state actors often involved in the same conflict that are not easy to identify by command structure or armies and uniforms and battlefields, etc. It's really gangs and ragtag rebels and traditional organized crime groups and terrorist groups and links between them, and using various tactics to finance themselves, or the way they use their way of violence. And this has made some of the traditional instruments of the UN, such as peacekeeping and mediation and using the good office of the Secretary General, much more difficult, and really requiring a much more comprehensive response that really covers multi-dimensions across the development, the military, the political, the justice, economic and social, and environmental areas. And that's one of the reasons why working with the bank is so important, because of this multi-dimensional problem that we're dealing with that requires also a multidimensional approach. And it really requires system thinking. There is in this complex environment, not really a linear world where we can expect a certain response if we pull a certain lever. We really have to think about systems that can change very quickly and have very different responses than we would have expected. In the United Nations, we have a couple of mechanisms where we really try to focus on this multidimensional character of risks that we face. And in that, we indeed include also natural disasters, epidemics, besides a violent conflict, although that is, of course, what I am very much focused on. First of all, we have what we call the regional monthly review, where we really are looking at country settings or regional settings, or also even thematic issues, and really approach that from all entities within the UN system. So we bring our human rights colleagues, the humanitarian colleagues, our economists, and our political and peace and security colleagues together to do this risk analysis and come up with compounded risks over the medium to short term. The second instrument that we have is the common country analysis and the cooperation frameworks that we conclude with governments that are based on this common country analysis. And we really, the guidelines for this analysis encourages to include many different actors, but certainly across the UN system, including the World Bank and the IMF, including also communities and civil society, local actors, because of course they bring knowledge about conflict dynamics to the table that we as international civil servants might not be able to reach. And what I would really leave you with is the importance not only to have anticipatory action 6 months or a few hours before something happens, but really think about a longer time frame, upstream and structural prevention. And I think the Pathways for Peace report really provides important inputs into entry points into that. So we really need to look at what are issues around natural resource management or about access to land and water, about migration flows and inequalities in socio-economic areas that we can as a system address now that might, through which we might prevent the escalation into violence 5 years down the line. And that move from focusing on the crisis of the day to a much more longer term upstream and structure prevention is something I think that we in the UN and the World Bank and the IMF as well can work much more closer on to reduce the human suffering that is so important in the Secretary General's agenda, that he says prevention is his first, his second, and third priority. So this is fully in line with also the reforms that he has implemented. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henk-Jan. You made really important points. I think you reminded us when we talk about early warning systems that the early warning, it goes beyond just having the data and information system which collects the information. It's a process which involves multiple actors, multiple stakeholders. So you need to get that richness and understanding of actually what is happening on the ground. It's a really important point. You also said something which resonates a lot with the World Bank group, which is the importance of, we call them, I heard somebody, the colleague the other day, he talked about anticipatory structural reforms. He's saying this is how we need to start thinking about these issues, because the climate change as one of the trends is really necessitating to think 5, 10 or 15 years in advance what needs to be done in order to mitigate or to adapt to it. This is linked also with your emphasis on the system thinking, building systems that they are going to be used to help the decision makers then to take the necessary action. And we do benefit a lot from the UN support and the collaboration in the number of the settings where I fully agree with you, we bring our different comparative advantages, and when sometimes we rely on your presence on the ground and the capacity to help us to implement some of the interventions that we support from our end. Extremely important intervention. Thanks a lot, Henk-Jan. Catalina, if I may, I would like to turn to you now, because you have been involved in a number of the efforts to promote the early warning and anticipatory action in a range of conflict-related contexts. So what do you see as some of the key challenges and opportunities in areas which are commonly affected by the compound risks? So over to you, Catalina. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you so much for the invitation. This is a topic that is very close to my heart. And I think that it is just absolutely relevant that we figured out the way how we can analyze risk much better to be able to do early action. So within the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, we have been implementing anticipatory action systems already for quite a few years. At the moment, we have more than 30 countries where we are setting up these systems. However, there is a very interesting thing that is happening, is that we haven't really been able to fully implement these type of projects in conflict-affected settings, or even in regions in a country that is affected by conflict. So, there are many reasons why. No, it's not necessarily because we don't want, no, but there are a lot of complexities around being able really to set up these efficient systems. And to talk a little bit about those challenges, I want to do an an example with my own country. So I'm from Colombia, and as many of you might know, it's a country we have been in conflict for several decades, and it's a perfect example to really analyze compound risks. We clearly have situations, for instance, in which like people is displaced because of landmines. So you have already those two elements. And often people get displaced to areas that are high risk. And there is no another option for them to really move to safer places. And then often they end up living in places that are very high risk of floods or landslides. But what is interesting of this and complex is that it is not only that they just get exposed to a flood or a single hazard, but they often are exposed to other hazards like earthquakes, volcanoes, technological hazards. But if we look at the conflict perspective, it doesn't mean that if they get displaced, the conflict just stops and they are not exposed. Actually, because of like Henk-Jan was mentioning, like the conflict dynamics change so much, the actors change so much that even if they are displaced to an apparently safer place, they still are exposed to the conflict impacts. So then you have all these different elements, like that get into the equation. And when we think about early action or early warning and early action, like we cannot be simplistic of saying, let's tackle this particular hazard, but we really need to understand all these different elements that enter into the equation. And I mean, to try to understand better, how can we set up these systems in the Red Cross Red Crescent? We have been trying to like test and figure out different ways of looking at this. So last year I worked in a paper that kind of like help us to understand how do we look at the concept of anticipatory action in conflict. And we look at two scenarios. So one thing is to do early warning, early action for a hydrometeorological hazard in a conflict context. Another element or other way of looking at it is to do anticipatory action for the humanitarian impacts of conflict, like displacement. And the third scenario is the combination of both. And I think these are the different elements that we are trying to understand in terms of like defining what can we set up for the different contexts that we have. So through all the projects and research that we're doing, I mean, there are some key lessons that are coming up. And I mean, one of the first ones is about the expectations of like what is really feasible in terms of early action. And I think the element of understanding risk, and in particular compound risk, is the essential part of this. If we really can understand how is people likely to be affected because of all these combinations of risk, we will be able to set up the decision-making systems that will allow us to define, yes, we act, or not, we don't act, but also it will help us to define exactly which are those actions that we can actually do, like realistically, what are those impacts that we could mitigate with very particular actions. So I think I praise a lot the work that GFDRR is doing now on really pushing forward a better understanding of compound risk. And I really hope that a lot of the result of the work that you are doing will help us to advance further this work. The other element, which is very important, I think Dirk-Jan mentioned it very well, is that we are in a process of learning from all the different projects that are being implemented, either supported by the SURF or by the START network or by the Red Cross Red Crescent. And I think one of our big responsibilities somehow, I don't know, Dirk-Jan, if you agree with me, is that we have to learn from all this. I mean, we need to set up the systems and the priority is really to measure what works and what doesn't work, and the methodologies and the process, and accepting that we don't necessarily will get things like perfect at the first time, but that we're committed to actually learning and improving over time. And the last thing that I want to say is that, I mean, because this topic is extremely important in the work that we are doing, in the framework of the Anticipation Hub, we have created a working group with different partners to really discuss the different elements of these topics. So whoever is interested, is super welcome to join. So thank you so much. Over to you, Indira.
Thanks so much, Catalina. I totally agree with you. You know, I'm not an expert on Colombia, but I was reading a bit on these Central American countries, on Honduras and El Salvador. And it's so intermingled, it's so complicated, you know, the natural disasters, the violence, then how that can also compound with the gender-based violence and how it increases all sorts of the tensions in a society. But then when you want to analyze and to issue the early warning, what is the action and who do you target? How do you focus it? It resonates so much with the I don't know, it's rewarding actually. This is a gender where it's really rewarding to work on, because hopefully we will highlight this complexity and get more clarity on how to improve our tools and our interventions. I do want to also to say that you made an extremely important point about essential to understand risks. Without understanding risks, well, then it's very difficult to construct and develop good early warning systems, and the importance of learning by doing and sharing these lessons and fostering this exchange of knowledge. So I wouldn't say anything about the expectations, because this is such a daunting challenge. So we are just plugging it one step at a time. And maybe that's a good segue to turn to Lindsay, because he is one of the architects of our efforts to, together with my colleague Bianca, who hasn't been able to join us today, on how do we monitor compound risks. So Lindsay, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Indira, and to the rest of the panelists too. Given that this is a fireside chat, I thought I would start off with maybe a confession. And it's something that I'm guilty of, and actually I think many of us might also be guilty of too. And that's that, you know, myself and many of the places where I have worked as well previously, you know, we've been guilty of thinking about risks in a very singular, unidimensional way, often restricted within certain sectors. And traditionally, you know, we've kind of just about gotten away with that. But really, COVID has really shattered that impression that we can get away with thinking about sector-specific risk information and early warning systems. All of a sudden, each one of us now are health experts, or at least, you know, we are kind of amateur epidemiologists, right? I'm now having to trawl through, you know, COVID-related data to do with, you know, lockdowns, things that I would never, if you'd have asked me this, you know, a year and a half ago, never would have thought that would have been part of my role and my job. So I think, you know, COVID has been a really welcome, you know, impetus for us as an early warning community, and one that you know, uses risk information and turns it into action. We no longer can get away with what we did perhaps in the past, which was thinking about sector-specific risk and trying to use that within our early warning systems. So I'm really excited as well that, you know, there has been a movement in places like the bank and the UN to kind of move towards compound risk, recognizing compound risk within our early warning systems, and trying to see how we can start to monitor that, recognize when there are changing signs that we really need to act upon. And I'm going to talk to you through one of the initiatives that we have worked on within the bank, together with some of the colleagues here on the panel. And that's the compound risk monitor. So this is under the guise of the Global Crisis Risk Platform, which I share with Indira and with Spyros. It's also work that we've been working very close with UN OCHA and UN PBSO to try and see how we can improve the way that we do our metrics and our monitoring systems to do with compound risk. So how have we gone about doing that? What sort of way of approaching that, you know, can we think about for trying to monitor compound risk? I think the first thing that we quickly found out was that any attempt right now to try and forecast compound risk is almost futile, right? We can't do that. We're not at a stage, and we may never get to a stage where in 6 months we can say that we can predict where there will be a compound risk issue. It's too complex. There are too many overlapping complexities that can't necessarily be forecasted at this point. So we kind of think about how can we scale things back and do the next best thing, which is recognizing where there are preconditions for compound crises and compound risk to occur. So that's our kind of entry point for thinking about how our monitoring systems can factor in compound risk. And we have to be comfortable with the fact that this isn't a predictive system. It's one where we're recognizing these preconditions might be intensifying in different areas and different regions. So our starting point really has been to design this as a kind of a flagging tool, right? So we're moving away from forecasted systems to flagging, where we see, you know, a number of different risk dimensions, all trending towards intensification of risk and threats. What we've done internally is to try and break compound risk down into the core elements that relate to some of our work and some of our operational activities. These are sort of 6 of the core building blocks that we've been working on. So things related to natural hazards. These are areas where we also have good risk information for, and ones where our kind of operational activities are targeted towards. So we have things like natural hazards, macro fiscal risks, obviously as well with COVID kind of showing us that has a wide-ranging impact on economies related to not just macro fiscal issues, but health-related issues too. Thirdly, health as a key sector, one that we're kind of monitoring as a risk dimension, conflict, food security, and household level socioeconomic vulnerability. So these are the 6 kind of core building blocks that we have identified as areas where we have good enough information to tell us in real time whether we have intensification of risks materializing, but also where we recognize that there are compounding effects between all of them, right? This is the challenge of doing a compound risk monitoring system whereby you can't look at them in isolation. So for each of these, again, we're not looking at them as hazards in themselves, because for compound risk, it's not necessarily a hazard that's the issue, it's the combination of hazards and vulnerabilities. You can have repeated hazards that occur that traditionally, a place has been able to deal with. But if you've eroded that ability to deal with those, if vulnerabilities have gone up, then again, you have, that's where your kind of precondition for compound crises occur can really intensify. So again, we're keen not to just monitor and look at hazards. We want to make sure that our warning systems and our monitoring systems factor in underlying vulnerabilities too. And that's why these 6 kind of core dimensions have aspects that relate to both hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. So how do we do that, right? How do we take these core building blocks, these flagging tools and dimensions, how do we design that into a system that, that we can use to look at preconditions? So essentially what we do is we identify core indicators for each of those 6 that we see as early warning signs, right? That lead us towards an understanding of risk conditions at the country level for all 6 of those. And in most cases, there are existing sector-specific early warning systems and tools that do that. For example, in food security, we have the FuseNet, system. There are various others in, today and the next few days, we'll be talking about the conflict early warning systems. There are many as well that are ongoing and operational throughout that. So essentially what we try and do is identify, where possible, the best kind of leading indicators for each of these 6. And we try to also see where there are thresholds, areas where we consider that risks might be intensifying to the extent where a country may no longer be able to deal with them, or where there's a heightened risk of being able of compounding, so that conflict risk might now materialize into something that affects food security or natural hazards or otherwise. So those are really important, identifying the thresholds beyond which we feel like those risk conditions have the potential to compound. And then what we then do is essentially try and compile a regional and a global to see where there are multiple flags, kind of multiple thresholds breached. So that gives us a really good sense then of where specific countries have kind of pockets of kind of intensification of potential for compound risk. I'll just wrap up in terms of explaining what our next steps are as a kind of as a process and as a collaboration across the UN and the World Bank. We really need to understand how compounding risks do affect these monitoring systems, right? At the moment, we treat these 6 dimensions as separate, which is not, in a sense, a compound risk tracker. It's a multi-dimensional risk tracker. But what we want to get towards is looking at different weights, different ways of combining those to see whether certain types of risks do really result in compounding effects. And the last thing as well is really, at the moment, we can only start doing this at the national level. The data is only just about good enough to give us that. Subnational is really where we start getting into real impacts. So we need to be moving towards, better application of compound risk monitoring systems and early warning systems that can allow us to look, underneath the national level, start looking at subnational level. I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks, Indira.
Many thanks, Lindsay, for sharing with us the effort on the compound risk monitor. What I took from it is that it doesn't really, we should not be looking at the sector-specific risks. So there is a need to look across the various risk dimensions, because there is an increasing interconnection or the interplay between the various risks. You also told us that it's very difficult to predict compound risk, and I think that most of us fully agree with you, because there's a lot of uncertainty there. Maybe partly because we still lack the data, which would help us maybe to move in that direction. The data availability and at which level we work on and what is the quality of the data is a critical ingredient of the good early warning systems. And I think that you also talk about the dimension that one of the dimensions that we are looking at is the conflict. So I would like to turn to Spyros to talk about it, because so far we talked about the compound risks, and we also emphasized the importance of monitoring early warning systems in the conflict environment. But fragile and conflict environment is maybe also the context in which risks compound each other. They amplify each other. So it's not only that the conflict is one of the risks, but it's also context in which certain things can amplify. And I want to ask Spyros on the world, what is the World Bank doing in terms of the conflict monitoring? What has been our approach? And what have we learned from it so far? Over to you, Spyros.
Thank you, Indira. It's a great pleasure to be here today on this panel. It's been a great discussion up until now. I will say a few general remarks and observations on the issue of compound risks and conflict prevention, and then turn to a few words on the role of the bank in the context of implementation of the Pathways for Peace report Henk-Jan also raised. I think the first point is that the confluence of different risk factors in leading to or contributing to destabilizing violence and conflict is not something new, right? I mean, we've been working on this basis for a number of years now. It's at the heart of many of our conflict analytical approaches, and very much at the heart of multidimensional approaches to conflict resolution and peace building. HDP Nexus is one articulation of this. What I think is new is the kinds of conflicts that we have seen over the past 10 years, and Henk-Jan I think spoke to this directly, the complex, protracted nature of these conflicts, wherein a lot of factors which in the past we might have considered as exogenous factors, climate change, food insecurity, macro financial crises, these are suddenly very core constituent elements in the dynamics that lead to the conflict, its nature, and its duration. So in a sense, many of these broader risks and the ways in which they compound have become front and center. We can't ignore them when we talk about conflict analysis, we talk about what we need to do in terms of prevention and peace building. And the COVID pandemic has I think, illustrated some of the shocks and stresses that a pandemic can cause on conflict and tensions in a very dramatic way, right? We've seen in some cases how these can tip dynamics and cause a trigger for conflict. In some forms, create even new forms of conflict as the situation or the shocks generated by the specific risk factor or the compounding nature of risk factors has been instrumentalized. We've also seen how responses to some of these risks have been done in a way that aggravates conflict and have not been conflict sensitive. So in the context of the crises and the conflicts we're seeing in places like Yemen, Somalia, but elsewhere, I think these really highlight the importance of better understanding how these different risks impact, how they interact, how they compound, and how they have a causal impact on the genesis of conflict. The days when conflicts can be resolved neatly through peace agreements are long gone. And we need to adopt and include and broaden the lens that we use, as Henk-Jan was saying, in terms of how we approach and how we work together across the international community to address conflict that takes into account these kinds of risks. So I think very much front and center. From a methodological perspective, I think we're living in a bit of a paradoxical context, right? On the one hand, we have an extremely rich universe of methodological approaches, of instruments, of experiences, as we've heard also today, which are informing our understanding of causal relationships between factors and the onsets and dynamics of conflicts. We're not there yet. I think there's a lot of experimentation, a lot of development still, a lot of constraints we have to deal with in terms of predictive modeling, but we're definitely getting more visibility and understanding what these issues are, how they impact, and what we have to do about them. One of the problems, however, one of the paradoxes here is that we're in a situation of methodological overabundance, almost in a sense. We have a variety of different theories, models, and approaches, each tied to specific interests, agendas, and end uses. And in some cases, this is leading to fragmentation, I think, in terms of how we think about this and how we act. So I think this is a point that one of the challenges we need to look at. How can we harmonize better our work on compound risks and as they relate to conflict? In addition to this, I think there's two big priorities in terms of frontier issues, where we go. And I'll speak very quickly to them before I move on to speaking about the bank. The first is, and directly to Lindsay's point, we have a good understanding of different risk factors, the shocks, the stresses, how they interrelate, but the corollary to that is also understanding vulnerability, right? And vulnerability will be different in country and different according to the situation in which that country is with respect to fragility and conflict. We need to understand what is it that what increases exposure to risks in one country and not in others, or to specific combinations of different risk factors. And we also need to understand vulnerability in the context of, in line with the pathways to peace, of the different situations that countries find themselves in. These are situations of maybe emerging risk. So this is the upstream structural focus on identifying what factors could lead to eventual destabilization and working to address those. It could be situations of high risk, where we're already seeing destabilization, and again, probably in the space of defining anticipatory actions to alleviate or mitigate the brunt of those shocks when they arrive on conflicts. But also, super importantly, which we don't normally think of when we talk about prevention or anticipatory action, also in context of active conflict. How do we focus on understanding vulnerability to shocks during context of protracted conflict, for instance, that allow people to continue to survive and to not fall into an acute situation of urgent needs. And then last but not least, going out, how do we prevent resurgence of conflict? How do we address those structural factors and susceptibility to risk that would prevent a resurgence of conflict or the emergence of new forms of conflict? So vulnerability, I think, is critical, but needs to be looked at these different kinds of contexts. Second, I think, big priority is when we talk about early warning, what we do about our data and analysis that we have on risk factors, probabilities, and likelihoods. Early warning signaling is important, but as many have said, it's not enough. How do we go beyond this to look at the deeper programmatic and operational thinking on measures to prevent and mitigate these risks from going on? And here again, we need to look at resilience is a key factor here, and there's a lot of work being done. I think things need to be connected to this discussion in a more integral fashion. How do we strengthen the resilience of institutions, of communities, of households to be able to absorb and cope and manage these risk factors and alleviate the impacts that they might have on destabilization and conflict? I have a lot more to say this, but I will skip very quickly to say a few words about the World Bank. The bank over the past couple of years, I think, has made a lot of progress in operationalizing key priorities that are in the pathways to peace. As many of you know, the bank has a new strategy on FCV, a 5-year strategy, which really kind of situates and is aimed to strengthen the bank's engagement across a range of different FCV situations, pre-conflict contexts, active conflict contexts, as well as transitions out of conflict fragility, as well as looking at what we call the spillovers of FCV in terms of cross-regional, cross-border dimensions, but also in terms of population displacement. Underpinning this strategy is IDA 19, of course, and as some of you might know, IDA 19 now has a very important mechanism within it, which is an FCV envelope, which provides additional financing to countries who are on these different type situations to allow them to address the different drivers and risks associated with FCV in those different contexts. To date, there have been 9 countries that have benefited from this envelope, to a total of about 3.4 billion and up until today. And these are providing extremely important mechanisms to address a number of the risks that we've been talking about and their relationship to fragility and conflict. What's very important and is anchoring a lot of this financing and operational work is also the now kind of institutional integration and systematization of certain analytical tools, such as the risk and resilience assessment, which provides our country teams an understanding of what are the risks and how they can be addressed through the bank's as a development organization. And there are many examples which I could perhaps raise if we have time for discussion. There's coughing a lot, so I will end there. Thank you once again for this opportunity.
Thanks a lot, Spyro. Sorry, I got this cough. Under strict guidance, right? Keep the limit, keep the speaker so that everybody can speak. Excellent contribution. Understanding risk intersectionality, I think this has become my mantra. This is what I think all the time about. I want to ask the panelists, we still have a bit more time, and I really want to turn to the panelists because you have provided such a richness and the different perspectives and shared with us your experience so far. And I think we all agree that this is an area where the additional work is needed. So I want to hear from each panelist, please, and very quickly, because we would need to wrap up soon. What do you see as a major research area? Where do you see our critical knowledge gaps? So if somebody asks you, what do you think we should invest to address as a knowledge gap related to the compound risk, early warning systems in the conflict environment, where would you advise us to focus? And let me start with the Dirk-Jan first.
Thank you so much. I think the distinction that Catalina made about working in conflict and on conflict is a really good distinction. And I think we haven't, so we've had this fantastic report, Pathways to Peace, but actually we need to actually have the reverse, Pathways to conflict and crisis, and figure out what is actually resulting in a crisis and what are the nodes that are available to us to actually fundamentally help countries change trajectory. For example, at the moment we're looking, so we're doing kind of like crises in conflict settings. So we had cholera in Yemen, drought in Somalia, flooding in South Sudan, and that's exacerbating the situation. We're currently trying to figure out, okay, let's look at South Sudan. I happen to have lived there for 5 years. You see seasonal patterns of drought and floods, and there's some high degree of predictability of migration and displacement as a result. And as a result, resource conflict that just exacerbates the conflict dynamics already in the country. If we understand that, are there then ways of preventing that? And I think there's a real tendency to make the problem too complex. We say, well, it's not unidimensional, it's compound risk. And now we need to understand all compounding dynamics. And before we actually understand everything, we can't do anything. And I think we should be a little bit more experimental and see what are compounding problems that we can solve and can get ahead of, and have a set of examples of where we can get ahead of compounding risk, particularly in the 80-20 countries. Essentially 20 countries that represent 80% of total humanitarian needs, and try to see where we can really move to the frontier of anticipatory action.
Thanks so much, Dirk-Jan. So it's a very good question. What are the compounding risks that we can solve? I think it really gives you the focus, and then it helps to target the action. Henk-Jan, can I turn to you very quickly so that each panelist has an opportunity to share their advice? Over.
Thanks. So my point would really focus on this upstream prevention, to really look at some of the more structural drivers of violent conflict, and how can they be addressed before they even become issues of grievances, as the Pathways to Peace report would have phrased it, before political entrepreneur tries to take advantage of certain perceptions around grievances coinciding with identity groups, and take advantage and mobilize against violence. So, this does not have to be framed in terms of prevention or in terms of peace building. This is really a much broader issue that can be framed in ways of social cohesion or risk reduction or resilience building, as Spyros was talking about. But it is clearly something that needs to be led by national actors, by the government, and other stakeholders in the countries themselves, and creating these coalitions around certain reform issues that addresses some of these issues that could potentially lead to violent conflict. If I just make an example of Mozambique, the North has felt marginalized for decades, and in fact was one of the reasons of the civil war. And putting a natural resource project in that region without certain measures in place with regard to the transparency of the revenues, transparency of the expenditures, and investing in that region is often a recipe for violent conflict. And so this is something that really could have been anticipated 5, 10 years ago. Thanks very much.
Colleagues, I believe Indira lost her connection temporarily, so I suggest we continue going around the table in responding to her question. So perhaps Catalina?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, good. So, I mean, actually, I'm so fascinated about the research on this topic that I decided to do a PhD about this. So I have like 3 million questions about this topic. And I think one of the fascinating things that definitely we need to understand better is it's a little bit the history, like this is not the first time that happens, like early warning systems had been in place for many, many years, not necessarily with the level of ambition that we are talking about, but they have been there. So I think there is definitely a need of understanding better historically what had happened in all these different countries where we know, that are very, high risk of disasters not to happen. And really reconstruct that history and understand, like what can we learn from that? So I think definitely that's one of the big areas of research that I will promote and that I'm actually doing within my own research, and also the understanding of the role again of local partners and really understanding like how the different institutions at local level, at very low administrative levels, can play a role into all this process, and how do we connect that with these more macro level processes that we are developing. So yeah, over to Lindsay.
Lindsay, very briefly.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll maybe raise 2 quick points. I'll try and keep them as quick as I can. I think the first one is something that Spyros kind of touched on, is that, we're pretty good at doing early warning systems for singular hazards, right? We're pretty good at identifying where there's a cyclone, where there's, potential for flooding and other hazards. We're not very good at early warning systems for vulnerability, right? Where there are intensification of kind of aspects of vulnerability that may not necessarily always relate to hazards. It might be an intensification of kind of underlying structural drivers of vulnerability that really needs to be monitored, but is much harder to look at. So that's one area. The second area that I think really needs some attention is understanding to what extent anticipatory actions, things that we build off once we've done our early warning systems, are they the same in the context of compound risk as they are in singular risks, right? Do we go about doing our horizon scans and taking action on those in the same way? Or is it much more complex? Does it require different ways and different tools to act upon those early warning systems when we're thinking about various different types of risk dimensions all interacting at the same time? So that's my quick spiel, and over to Spyros now.
Thank you very much. I think I'll be very, very brief. I think for me, a big priority going forward is, doing more research and learning from what's already being done, right, to address compound risks and its relationship to conflict and violence. Like I said before, this is not something new, and we've got, I think, a lot of examples out there of what's being done to not just identify, monitor, but also act on it, right? Dirk-Jan, I think, raised a very important example, which is the cholera response in Yemen. I think it was 2017. For me, that's a brilliant example of how actors across humanitarian development and peace building domains work together to identify a series of compounding risks, which were not just, they were health related, but they were compounding, right? Impacting food security and so forth. And they work together to provide, on the one hand, life-saving assistance to support those who were in dire need and impacted by the disease, whereas actors like development actors like the World Bank moved in and worked on water distribution systems, sanitation, and so forth. And together, they were able to mitigate the impact of cholera on already very complex type of situation, which speaks to, I think, Dirk-Jan's point about we need to kind of break this down into manageable chunks from an operational perspective. We can't do everything, all at the same time. We have limited resources, limited focus, individualized mandates, right? And there's a cost to coordination. So we've got to do what's possible strategically to be able to alleviate some of the big risks. So I think we need to balance a little bit the superb research work that's being done on developing systems, models, to also kind of looking what we're actually doing, right, to address these, right? There's a lot of hit and misses, right? But there's a lot of really important stuff that sometimes is not given the visibility that it deserves. It's going to, we're all busy with something else, right? And it's kind of lost in the shuffle of time. So I would leave it at that. Indira, you're back. I'm very happy to hand over back to you for the closing.
Thanks so much, and apologies to everyone. I had some connection issues. Let me start first by thanking the panelists for their extremely useful and thought-provoking contributions. I think that they shared the challenges. They gave us a glimpse of how difficult it is to do the compound risk monitoring, not least in the context of FCV countries. Sorry, my connection is just going up. This is a compound risk of internet connection from Croatia, right? So this is, there you go, you got the flavor of it. But I really wish to thank you all for the excellent comments and the contributions. This is certainly the agenda which requires much more effort and much more work. We heard a lot about the need to be focused, to use this analytical work and also the instruments to improve our targeting, to ensure that it helps us to reach those in needs faster, and also to ensure and to make an effort to act early and to be able to take action on the things before they really deteriorate and before they start hurting or creating the conflict or the bad things in the countries. COVID-19 is, I wouldn't say it's a reminder, but it's a testimony that the sector-specific approach alone is not sufficient anymore. We really need to look at this in an integrated way. I think that we are going to, from the bank side, we will certainly continue collaborating with our partners and benefit from the work that they are doing. And because this is not an agenda that it's possible to advance on our own. So this really requires the working across the agencies and the collaborating. One issue we did not discuss, but maybe I can leave all of us with it, so maybe something for another opportunity, is the issue of incentives. So if we know that the things are going to happen, if we have the early warning signals, how do we incentivize our governments or the communities to really act upon these early warning signals? Because as Dirk-Jan said at the beginning, and also Henk-Jan and Catalina and my colleagues, it makes sense. It really makes sense. It helps save lives and it helps to save the lots of cost and the grief to act early. But the incentives is a big elephant in the room. How do we start working on that agenda? So with that, and again, for the apologies for my internet troubles, I wish to thank everybody, and let's continue working on this agenda. Thank you so much.